It's a big moment for us every year coming together and sharing the results with you for the icon brands. And it's probably for me one of the most fascinating moments because we get as researchers the luxury to delve into 15,000 interviews. And I know we get excited about it because we are researchers and we are nerds in a certain way, but data really, really gets us all excited. And I'm hoping to share with you today some of the facts that we have learned and what we have gained this year in terms of the analysis. So from a content perspective, briefly, what you would be looking at is looking at how society is changing. And it's not always about understanding how society is changing, but we need to understand what these implications of the changes are for the brands that we represent and market in our country. The first thing from a more content perspective I will talk to you a little bit about is what's happening to loyalty. Is loyalty declining? Is it increasing? Why? What's happening? And what's actually sitting behind these changes? The second theme would be looking at the roadmap to an icon brand. What is the right things? What is the things that makes an icon brand? And what do these brands do differently to the brands that's not yet achieving icon brand status? We will then look into which social trends is actually setting the pace. So which specific social trends are sitting behind the changes that we are seeing and how consumers are acting differently and behaving differently with regards to brand. And then hopefully I will share with you one or two thinking paradigms that we might have to reconsider or challenge ourselves about a little bit more in order to really understand to what extent they still hold true in a changing society and going forward. Okay. Now obviously I think most of us have a very different and a very real sense of excitement in terms of being part of Africa. But as much as we often embrace and hang on to the uniqueness in terms of what we perceive our country to be, and sometimes celebrating the uniqueness of what we think we have that's good and different to the rest of the world, but also sometimes going a little bit depressed and thinking we're very unique also in our struggles, things like corruption, etc., which is pretty much all around us. It is important to also understand that we are not immune to the global context. We're not immune to the influences and how these things and issues and crises that's happening around the world actually also impacts the South African and the local consumer. I think one of the first things that we often hear about, we'll speak about that quite a bit today, is the rise of the middle market. Now the middle market is growing and there's a lot of opportunity embedded in the rise of the middle market, but often what goes side or hand in hand with the rise in the middle market is our resources are coming under pressure. The moment resources are under pressure, we start competing for it, which often results in wars and conflict and very uncomfortable situations of discontent. But I think as much as that is the reality, what we also see happening typically when we see these pressures and these implosions happening is we see our trust levels are dropping. And if you look at the Ask Africa Trust Barometer, we also see the trust levels dropping year on year when we measure trust in the South African business context. Now, trust imploding is usually a lead indicator of a lack of alignment between business, political context, social and economic context. And that means as business we need to look out for these implosions because of the lead indicating messages it gives us in terms of how we need to realign our brands and our brand strategies to remain relevant to a market where from a consumer perspective things are changing quite dramatically and it has quite a significant impact on our expectations. Now perhaps one can also think about loyalty as a kind of a recession. Maybe loyalty is also in a recession. Maybe it will recover and maybe it will not. But if you look at loyalty quite closely in terms of what has happened over the past few months, and I always enjoy using my clicker and then I can't if I'm standing next to the slide, I'm tempted to do it on my screen, but you can really see how loyalty has been dropping specifically since last year. Now loyalty is not dropping because brands are necessarily less relevant in terms of cutting through the demographic profiles. In terms of icon brand status, loyalty is dropping because consumers are committing less to brands consistently. They're not necessarily supporting the same brand month on month. It's not necessarily that they alternate from one brand to another, but it's often also because brands are starting to compete across categories. So the money that I spend on a particular product or on a particular product given in this particular month, I might have to spend that share of wallet on a different brand in a different category next month because economically, as consumers, we're experiencing a very different and a very real sense of pressure. Now, if we look at how icon brands gets it right to actually connect with consumers on a very deep and fundamental way, I think one of the first indicators, if you just look at what naturally happens when we look at the data, is we see that brands that are able to connect with lifestyle seem to be the front runners in terms of icon brand status. Brands that looks at restaurants and fast foods, drinks, foods, travel and leisure, that really enhances or creates some kind of different impact from a lifestyle perspective, seem to be doing better in terms of achieving icon brand status. That's obviously followed by a basic sense of being responsible. Communication is an essential part of who we are today. We had an interesting conversation just before the conference at our table, saying that we are probably more likely to turn back if we leave our wallets at home than our phones at home than to drive back when we've left our wallet at home. So it is about making sure we've got our communication sorted out, some of our financial products sorted out, and then only will we move over, if the lifestyle is contained and our being responsible is contained, to go into some sort of retail therapy. And I won't go into that because I am probably now targeted as being quite guilty. Once we've progressed through that, there is some depth to us all. We actually do like and enjoy intrapersonal enrichment. So we are seeing more of that happening in society, where consumers are actually saying, you know what, I do gardening, I have hobbies, I take care of my health, because it's not always about an interpersonal connection, but I also need to take increasingly more care of myself. And these seems to be 4 softer trends or themes that we are seeing in the data in terms of what icon brands are really starting to get right, or how they differentiate from the rest of the market. Now yes, we've, like with any other brand, there's nothing that beats a good pair of shoes. I will admit that. So in South Africa, unfortunately, we do think that well-known brands are better. If we compare it to the global index, we are putting a different kinds of emphasis on it. We still do value good and well-known brands. But it's not that superficial. It's not only about glam. It's not only about luxury. We also support these brands because we're more familiar with these particular brands. A brand that's more well-known and that's more familiar, we can access more information about these brands. We know what they stand for, and they often tend to be a bit more transparent. So we can make a different kind of judgment call, and I think that sits also behind this growing comfort and sense of support that we still give to bigger brands. They're familiar, we know them, and it's easier for us to trust them because it's easier for us to learn more about them and what they actually stand for. Now, if you look at why loyalty is slipping, I think a few years ago, loyalty cards was introduced, and we believe that loyalty cards will actually influence behavior and will really support spend in terms of specific brand categories, but things are changing. Loyalty is not about price, service and quality anymore. It's not about the product features anymore. There's much more things that's actually coming into play where consumers are starting to expect more from brands. Value for money, yes, I do think it's an important criteria. I do think it actually matters. I sometimes doubt if a consumer goes through all that kind of mental activity every time they purchase something. I think sometimes we rationalize that it's good value for money, and that makes our purchase slightly better. But I don't think in every single category I really go into the shop and I think about, yes, I think this is good value for money, let me consider moving forward with a purchase. Some of it is obviously valid, but I sometimes think we tend to overrate it. Loyalty cards, I think David from Clicks put it beautifully earlier when he said it's a ticket to the game. We're not going to get more brownie points for loyalty cards, but it's expected. We're in a society where we feel a little bit more entitled. There's a different sense of entitlement and obligation almost. It's not a gift to say thank you for my purchase, it's expected. It's just, how's your loyalty card better than another loyalty card? It won't necessarily change too much of my behavior because I will actually have enough space to use a range of loyalty cards, which is just literally starting to become part of purchasing and how we engage with brands and products. Now, interesting, if we look at what has happened with the icon brands that sort of remained stable and remained in the tracking for the past few years, and pretty much looking at it from 2011 to 2013, what I think is surprising if you look at it is it remained pretty stable. Allgold 60-60 if you look at 2012-2013, Hewlett's 57-55. The only two that actually showed quite a steep difference was Nokia and Black Hat Peanut Butter. Nokia, I think it makes sense. I think it's still a massively popular phone for a very big part of the South African market, and that's why it's still up there doing the right things right. But obviously more competition coming in from the iPhone category. But Black Hat, I think, is a phenomenal symbol of what's happening in our society, with not only Black Cat being one of the only brands that's increased their score quite dramatically, but Yum Yum being another peanut butter brand that made the top rankings this year for the first time. So there's obviously something happening in the peanut butter category. And next to shoes, it's a personal favorite, so I have endeavored to look into peanut butter and understand what is going on. I actually forgot about it, but there's actually a National Peanut Butter Day in America, 24th of January, to state its significance. Hemingway was quite a fan, Elvis was quite a fan. Some of them ate onions on it. It was done with bananas and bacon. I think the latest trend in America is pickles and peanut butter, and I won't go that far. But what peanut butter does, and I think why it's becoming such a good symbol for what is happening from a societal perspective, it takes us back to comfort. It's comfort food, but it's more nutritious, it's healthier. So it makes it slightly better than chocolates to some extent, or again, we can rationalize ourselves out of it. It's nostalgic, it takes us back to memories, it gives us a different sense of sustenance. I remember, and it's maybe not something to share without really making you worry, but when I was little, there was a kind of peanut butter with white bread, and then it was cut on a plate on the logo. And my mom never bought us white bread; it was sinful or something. And then every now and then, when we managed to do it, I would make myself peanut butter sandwiches and cut it like the picture and put it on, and just to feel like I was having that experience. So, but what's what it does to us. It takes us back to that kind of memory and nostalgia. And even now, if you look at top restaurants, it's actually becoming a very significant gourmet item in most of the top restaurants in Pretoria, Gauteng, Joburg, Cape Town, pretty much all over the world. Okay, so I think we need to look at peanut butter and what they're getting right. There's some messages in that. So what is driving icon brand status? What makes a brand an icon brand? What is these brands getting right and different to what the non-icon brands are getting right? And I think this quote actually just depicts it beautifully. Companies will need to start designing brands from the outside in by creating experiences built around a real relationship and bond with their customers. At the core of this relationship lies profound insights into the heart and mind of the customer. And I think that's what it's all about. Brands cannot or no longer be designed on the inside. It's no longer a brand decision for the corporate. If it's loose or removed or far away in any shape or form from the consumer, it will become increasingly irrelevant. It would lose traction and it will lose loyal consumption, and I think it's pretty much close to a fact. Now, one of the big shifts that we have seen is that the successful brands manage to move away from aspiration to inspiration. And I think there's a very, very significant difference in that. I don't want to go evil now, but I think what we need to be careful of as marketers and brand owners is that we don't look at accolades that reward and celebrates our achievement in terms of to what extent a brand is being aspired to or liked. It's not about aspiration and like anymore. We need to also deal and face the bad news. We also need to face the harder facts, the tougher messages in terms of understanding if we accept accolades, what does it really stand for and what does it tell me about my brand's success? If brands cannot cut through the clutter of aspiration and really start getting consumers to be more actively involved and participative in the brand journeys, it's not going to be that much more successful in the current era that we are finding ourselves in. It's really about a tangible measure of success. It's really about getting consumers to really understand that they need to participate or act or start co-creating and building bigger legacies as opposed to just buying from brands. So it's a little bit in terms of moving from buying to building and some kind of combination of the two, but passivity is not going to get brand engagement going up moving forward. Now there are 6 main things or themes that came up in the research which we saw statistically when doing the analysis, so it's not a conceptual thumbsuck, it's not like there's something in peanut butter and we read all about it and we get closer to the findings. This was really done statistically to determine what makes an icon brand different from a non-icon brand. And there's 6 things that these brands get right. The first one is to understand the rise of the middle market, to understand the opportunity in that, and understand how to create comfort, and that's where inspiration is coming from. The middle market wants to feel inspired. We want to wake up. We want to feel more. We want to create a little bit more of a cognitive balance, and we can only do it if we actually wake up our senses to feel and to actually sometimes even feel emotion. They get and grasp the rise of digital and social media very differently. They get that social media is not about traditional media gone digital. It's fundamentally different and expects something completely different from a consumer perspective. It's about South Africanism, really getting what localizing means, even if it is a global brand, but how to truly and effectively adapt that local brand presence in a local context. It's about the era of intolerance. And I think what we're after, and it also sits quite hugely behind the concept of that sense of inspiration that we're after, but there's a sense of intolerance and we need purpose. And the youth market, obviously a very big part of the middle market, and then what we refer to as experience as the new black. And I think we'll talk about that quite a bit more, but experience is not something that you can do in isolation. You need some kind of participation to experience, even if it's a mental participation, but you cannot passively experience, then it's not really a true fulfilled sense of an experience that we are creating. So these are the 6 things that we will now unpack in a little bit more detail to show you how it's becoming more relevant in the current society. Rise of the middle market, the first one. Now I think quite clearly the middle market is growing. It's an increasing market segment. There's more and more happening within that market. There's enough volume to make any brand manager or strategist or marketing strategist sit up straight and think, how can I capture more of this particular market? Even if they might not be the most relevant segment for your brand today, because we are improving, because we move up, they might become more relevant to our brands and our products over time. And we cannot ignore them now if we want to capture them in the future. Now, what does the middle market look like? So it's maybe a good slide to look at in terms of judging your own relevance from a marketing and brand strategy. But they're typically your nest builders and settled singles. So they're slightly younger, probably about 33 years of age. Mix of single and never married and married, so pretty much a mix from a marital status perspective. They're usually between 15 and 44 years of age, but the bulk of them sits between 35 and 44 years of age, so obviously most of us in the audience. Work status, pretty well balanced between working and non-working. And if you look at the life values to try and feel and sense them a little bit more, they're typically a little bit indifferent. And we'll talk about that also a little bit more. We're a bit bored as a society. So they're a little bit indifferent. They find little they agree with. They've got fairly neutral attitudes. They tend to be a bit conservative and self-focused, which I think is also another big social trend at the moment. But they put themselves first. So they're very motivated, but to and from and by myself. So very self-motivated, self-focused individuals. Usually the household includes about 3 to 5 people. And LSM-wise, typically about LSM 6 to 8. But we're migrating, so we're not often stuck in this category, and that's why we need to understand them now for being relevant to them later. Now, if you compare them in terms of global context, globally the middle market is about 37. South Africa is slightly younger, 33. Number of people in the household, slightly more for South Africa than we see, and obviously it makes sense, I think, relative to the rest of the world. People having children, slightly less. So it's reducing, and it's obviously a lot of opportunity and sometimes the lack of opportunity residing in fertility rates going down. Bachelor's degrees, not too bad, about 9% relative to the global average of about 10%, but we'll speak a little bit more about education later. Now I think the important bit to realize and to take a different kind of cognizance of, because we know this, it's not new news, but I don't think we always consider it, is that because families are getting bigger, households are getting bigger, we've got more generations locked up in one particular household. I think this puts a very different question to the whole concept of decision maker, and I think it makes the concept of decision maker a very dangerous concept to work with or to put too much power behind. I don't know about your families, but in my family I've got very little choice or decision making when it comes to what we eat and what we consume. My little boys are quite prominent in what we will consume. So the whole concept of main purchaser, main decision maker, I don't really think that exists to the same extent that it did a few years ago. There's far more influences, there's far more people in the household that needs to find something in a brand, in brand messaging, in products that needs to be relevant to all of them. A brand needs to be able to go into a household and appeal to some extent to more people than only a main decision maker, because the person buying or the person paying is not necessarily the person deciding or the person consuming. There's big differences, I think, that we need to reconsider when we think about household influences, the people we target to, the people we believe will make the final decision in terms of what's being bought or not. I think also brands that's getting it right are brands that can make themselves relevant across generations and across life stages. I think brands like KFC does it particularly well in terms of how they can carry their brand through those nostalgic moments and actually show how their brands remain relevant across or throughout life. If I liked KFC when I was little, chances are I will like KFC when I'm older. It really managed to show that kind of relevance across age groups and across generations and life stages, taking their consumers with them across that journey and not focusing too specifically only on certain pockets, but losing out on some of those life stage relevances. Now the next one that we are looking at is the youth market, which is another big one, obviously centered, and especially when we looked at the age groups, 15 years already being covered quite substantially within the middle market. But I think when we think about the youth market and we think about the middle market even, we also need to look at the opportunity within the market and the risk factor. The opportunity, I think, is that what we've looked at is the biggest opportunity is actually between 15 and 44 years old, maybe more specifically 35 to 44 years old. The youth are influencing the current decision maker. They are saying what they want. They are giving more input in terms of brands and what brands stand for and what they... And I think they challenge a little bit more sometimes in terms of doing the right things and seeing the right kind of brand conduct. But if we treat them well and if we don't necessarily judge them because of their current spending power, we might be building and creating a different kind of sustained audience for our brands. The risk segments are 45 plus because they tend to be more likely to explore the alternative. So is the LSM or the upper LSMs as well. And I think it's because maybe when we're slightly older, maybe if we're LSM upwards, not all of us, some of us, I'm definitely one of them, I don't believe adventure is about heights and ropes. Adventure for me is about shoes, it's about trying new things, it's about tasting sometimes new products, so we just take adventure a notch down. As I said, not all of us, some of us like those very irresponsible things, but we explore things differently, we work with things differently, so that's why we don't necessarily have a captive market when we think about 45 years and up and the upper LSMs. We need to tread carefully there because we might not have them in the bag for long because they are more inclined to look at other things and they probably are financially a little bit more comfortable in most instances to go there and to explore and try more things, to just excite things a little bit more. To cut through the clutter though, I think for brands to really understand how to differentiate themselves and really stand out for the crowd, we need to make sure that our call to action is moving away from not only buying, but buying and building. Because it's only when we start talking about a more emotional kind of connectivity, we can really get a different sense of engagement and involvement and relationship going between ourselves and our customers. One very good opportunity for that, I suppose, would be looking at the middle market, the education concept. And I think if we look at the bottom bit of the slide, the lighter orange graphs, we can see that grade 12 for matriculation is actually on the decline. And I think it's quite clear that our educational system is still failing our youth. And if we're not going to become a bit more actively involved in this, we're going to also fail our future market and the future share of wallets that our brand is going to be dependent on. If young people are successful in terms of cutting through and making sure that they can get their matriculation, we are seeing a slight increase in terms of tertiary education or individuals being able to get a degree in South Africa, which I think is promising and it says a lot about the talent we have in our country. There's lovely initiatives that's already happening. I know Bostik has a creative program that they're running with schools where they also give supplies to schools that obviously makes a difference to the specific school at hand. All Golden Enterprise have got lovely feeding schemes happening at schools, but we also need to consider tutoring. We also need to understand where else is the system failing and how can we get involved, probably on a more practical level, to really make sure we get a more successful youth and we actually participate where we know they are failing. We know the education system is failing, so if we know about it, I think we need to do a bit more and support a bit more in a more hands-on and real way. Now the next theme is the rise of digital and social media, and I think quite clearly, which is not a surprise, if you think about South Africa relative to the world, it's baby steps. We're still in infancy if you think about digital penetration in South Africa versus the rest of the world. We also see that social media seems to be doing slightly better, and I think it does slightly better partially because it's easier to access and use and mobilize with our phones as opposed to more complicated websites. But I think what we need to remember is that digital does not mean traditional media gone digital. It's not going to be sufficient. Digital platforms is not about creating awareness, it's about empowering choice. It's about empowering choice, it's about eliciting some kind of interactivity and experience. And only if we start using these platforms accordingly, we will start getting different kind of experiences and relationships going, and probably getting our brands to differentiate more in the market. Now, I think this picture says it all, but I think we're pretty much stuck in a phase of boredom. And I think that's what we're after as consumers. I think that's why we are putting so much pressure on things that makes us feel something, why we're putting so much pressure in terms of experiencing things, looking for goodwill, looking for things that will actually make us take note of what's happening around, because we need things to make us feel again and to get that cognitive balance sorted out. It's probably also due to some kind of overload on many fronts. It's long hours, it's hectic, it's busy lifestyles, there's a lot of things going on, there's a lot of bad news around us, and we actually just need something to make us feel good and give us some sense of hope again, to get that sense of need and that sense of purpose. But I think what we need to get up to a point is also to get consumers to mindfully engage, because I think that's the difference. We're not quite getting mindful engagement, we actually get mindless clicking. We're clicking at things which doesn't make sense to click at. We see things, and once we've seen more of the same, we don't always really recognize what we are seeing, but we are passively recognizing it by giving it a like. And what does 100,000 likes mean? What does it mean if it's just a passive recognition of something that's wrong? The brands that's getting it right, I think, is also understanding where consumers are really at. Now, consumers, and as a society, we're pretty much at a place where voyeurism and exhibitionism and selfishness are becoming quite important. And just as important as it is for brands to cut through the clutter and to be seen, as consumers we find ourselves, because of this boredom, because of all the noise and all the stress, we want to be seen. We want to cut through the clutter. We want to really show ourselves to the world. But the flip side of that is we expect brands to get it. We expect brands to get who we are and what we stand for. And only once they grasp that fully, their marketing and brand strategies will be more relevant, and I will feel more inclined to choose and opt to associate with that particular brand. So as much as I find this awkward, in a sense, that we are so focused on who we are and having to show ourselves, I think it's a very real fact and a reality in terms of how we live at the moment. So brands almost need to see themselves as a badge, used for bricolage identity construction, because I think that's what it's all about, or getting to become. And consumers want to belong to something that they actually share some values with and opt to build that association with. I think this one also says it quite well. We don't have a choice on whether we do social media, but the question is how well we do it. South Africa is still behind, but we are getting there. Word of mouth is actually on digital steroids, because that's what social media is enabling. So we need to consider this. Do you like what is said about your brand? Yes or no? And are we close enough, and are we really seeing consumers for what they're actually trying to shout out and really put out there in our faces in order to help us to be a bit more relevant? Now, the era of intolerance, I think, is another interesting one. And intolerance is really, it's more than just about emotional intolerance. I think we're struggling with that. We're becoming a bit more impatient. Our expectations are becoming slightly unrealistic at times. We've got things like xenophobia. But I also think there's a very physical, real kind of intolerance. We talk about lactose intolerance, glucose intolerance. There's probably more intolerances, which we didn't seem to have before. Now, I am by no means a nutritionist, and I'm sure there's lots of things changing, but I think we need to look at the concept of intolerance a bit more broadly. It's not only emotional, it actually sits with a very strong physical undertone at the same time. I think where we also are as a country, and for those of you who don't know, but South Africa is actually one of the most unhappy countries in the world, unhappy people in the world. So I refer to us as being happiness challenged. So sometimes we're technology challenged, but I also think we are happiness challenged. And I think because we are happiness challenged, that's why we struggle with the whole theme of boredom. And we get a lot of bad news. We like Oscar, and then Oscar does strange things, and then we struggle. And then we've got Marikana, we've got Malema, and we've got all kinds of heroes that go stray. And I think it's why we've got now a very different need for real heroes, but everyday heroes, because it's harder for them to disappoint. thinking about this whole worrying thing and the semitone of depression that we are suffering from. We won't show rise of hands for white tablets, but there might be quite a few. But if we think about the current concept, I think what we're after is we want to be warriors, not warriors. We want to worry and stress less, and we want to participate more in things that's meaningful and valuable, that can ignite feeling and make us feel a bit more alive. But we're looking at brands to actually create it. And the brands that does it well are the brands that really can tell the local stories. Can tell the local stories because we're sick of bad news. There's just too much. And I think sometimes that's the struggle of mainstream newspapers, but the perfect opportunity for local community papers where they've got a different platform validated by Warren Buffett in terms of local news is the news that we're really after. It's the good news, it's the more optimistic news, it's the better stories that we would like to associate with. It makes just a bit more sense in terms of why we're hanging on and what we're doing. And it's the stories that we can actually relate to. We can relate to these stories easier and better. But the big thing is to get the consumer up from its seat and getting them to participate, empowering them to actually participate, co-build and co-create. Now the next one is South Africanism. And I think most of us will agree, but I think in South Africa we've got this thing of that Africa's the tough country, it's not for the faint-hearted. It makes us super special. It makes us much more special than anybody that does not have to roam the streets with elephants and lions. We're just really, really different. So there's a rebellious pride that sits in terms of how we hang on to our uniqueness and how we are different. But it also means there's a little bit of a resistance to global trends. We don't want to accept it simply because it is a global trend. We're very proud to be South Africans and obviously Ask Africans. We expect localization, and the icon brands are specifically brands that also get this right, that manages this localization and that manages to work with how and why we can be proud of our country. It's a relatable happiness that we are building. I think rhinos to some extent is probably, because I've thought long and hard about this and I can probably be quite controversial and even border on being unpopular, but it's interesting for me why we are so much behind rhinos, who's to an extent a little bit more emotionally removed from people. And as a country we've got a hell of a lot of issues that we can work with. We've got more than one big problem in this country that actually needs commitment. But I think getting out of the boredom, it's almost as if we are looking for a cause. We need a cause, and rhino seems to be a very good cause, and it's ours. It's a South African cause, it's our rhinos. And it's maybe where it makes more sense on some level. We also spoke about it at the office the other day, but even if you look at the youth, the generation Y is the first generation that hasn't had a cause. They didn't go through the 60s or apartheid. They haven't had a real cause to look for. And what we often see when we look at their behavior is they go from one cause to another cause, but it's almost like one-night stands. It changed quite quickly, and it's this cause of being all green, but then I've got my iPhone and I've got my big cup of coffee and glass, and everything else around me does not quite support the same idea, but it's today's cause. Tomorrow is something else. So let's not patronize the concept of it, but we need a cause. As a country, we need a cause. And I think that's what we are trying to do, and really owning our rhinos, because it makes us feel, again, a bit more unique and probably a bit more depressed. Another reason to just feel a little bit more depressed. Let's rationalize it if you can't fight it. Okay. Then the second last one is the last one, actually, is experience. And I actually want to show you this one in a video because I think the clip that I've got just says it all. But the key concepts for me regarding experience is to realize that experience is not about the smell of the coffee in the bank. That's not an experience. That is something that's there, and probably now again a very tangible expectation. But an experience can only come to life if there's some kind of action or some kind of participation involved, even if it's just mentally, even if it's just something that I feel and think. But yes, see, if I walk through that branch and the person's exceptionally friendly and they welcome me and they're just all great, I'm not going to look here, this was a lovely experience. Remember, we're bored, so it needs a little bit more to cut through that. Those things are important, but it's basics. We're not going to get brownie points because of that anymore. It can't really translate into the kind of experiences that we are asking from the brands that we engage with. And I think this one actually shows and depicts the kinds of real experiences and how all the trends that I've shared with you now actually came together in what Nike managed to do with this particular campaign. In summary, I want to leave you with 10 trends and another last brilliant clip, but a short one, I promise. But I think what it all boils down to is we find ourselves in an era where modern meaningfulness really makes a difference. We've said it quite a few times. We need to cut through the boredom. We want something that creates meaningfulness, that makes us a little bit more emotional, that gets us out of our passivity, but something that really stands out for us and get us to feel again. We've got a growing consciousness. We know more, we read more, we need more transparency. We go after brands to some extent to really understand what they stand for, to what extent does it fit in with the identity that I have for myself and how I construct myself to see if that brand actually fits or not. So there's a growing consciousness that we need to be very aware of. Experience is the new black. I think this clip showed it beautifully, from engaging digital in a very different way, getting us out of the passivity, taking back what we stand for, really resonating with our values. It's really done everything right. I think if I was a university professor, I would have taken that one for an assignment. Really a good explanation of what's going on. There's that rebellious pride, the emphasis on localization that is so important for the sense of pride that we have with our country and what we expect brands and how we expect brands to actually adapt themselves and be locally relevant. We do it my way. Anything goes as long as it's the way I expect it to be. So that sense of entitlement, that sense of brand strategies and market strategies needs to be created from the outside in. It's what matters most to the consumer. That's what's going to create a sustainable future for your brand. There's demanded goodwill. It's no longer about doing the right things because of governance or because of what a policy dictates or because it's the right thing to do. It's actually demanded. And so often when we engage with clients, they would say, yes, but we're quite humble. We don't share these things. Well, great. You can be humble as much as you like. Your consumers actually expect to know it. They expect to see it. That's the way they dictate the messages. They decide how it will be communicated and that they actually expect to see it. There's a holistic loyalty. Loyalty is much more complicated than price product, a good quality product at a good price with good product features and great service. It's more holistic. Things like how we participate in our world, how we make things better, how we uplift, how we make a difference, how we get people to feel, how we create real experiences are becoming part of the loyalty expectation, part of the loyalty equation. It's definitely an age of intolerance. I think we need to grasp that. I think we can also see it in Hello Peter, the negative commentary, how social media is often used to really terrorize brands, I suppose, to some extent. But there is a different sense of intolerance that's very, very real, and we need to understand that and how we can work with that and probably work with the kind of discontent that we are finding and seeing at the moment. There's entitlement imbalance, so it's no longer because and thank you, it's really expected. There's obligations and it's expected that we give more than what we actually get from consumers most of the time. And yet, I think there's an inflicted depression. It might even be a self-inflicted depression, but there's so much going on around us. There's so much we need to cope with. There's so much about being the best in so many different areas that, so much bad news that we are actually struggling with a little bit of a happiness challenge. And I think that's what sits behind this incredible need to feel and to experience things that's more real, with more purpose and with more meaningfulness. I think, again, just a clip that I think shows what localization really means, shows what happiness can really look like, shows that we can create different kind of experiences, but just to become alive a little bit more and to co-create something as opposed to just watching and observing and judging it passively.